The Tacoma-Pierce County. There we
All
go.
right.
Thank you for doing that. Now we're recording. So the Tacoma-Pierce County Affordable Housing Consortium is a nonprofit membership-based organization. We provide public education and advocacy for the expansion of affordable housing in Pierce County and its jurisdictions. We do this by educating the public on the need for affordable housing, by hosting webinars, meetings, and collecting data to share with the public and our members. And we also advocate for state and local levels for policy and funding that will support the creation of more affordable housing. And we've got about 60 members from affordable housing developers, financiers, construction companies, architects, consultants, and individuals as well, all dedicated to advancing affordable housing in Pierce County. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about us, you can visit our website, and you can also email me directly if you ever need to do that. Here's my email and our website here in the chat. And I'll post that again towards the end, just in case. So with that, I would like to introduce Cynthia. So Cynthia has worked for decades in the field of public works, including management roles on the King County Council Central staff and the King County Solid Waste Division and the King County Airport, where she was designated Airport Manager of the Year by the Washington State Department of Transportation. She has also consulted with many small cities on development of capital facilities plans and served as Deputy County Manager in Thurston County, where she was responsible for finance, including funding for capital facilities plan. And so after retiring, Cynthia became an active League of Women Voters member and has served on their advocacy team for transportation and as support for healthcare and revenue. So never stops, always working. In the last several years, she's worked intensively on homelessness issues and now lobbies for the League around homelessness and housing and revenue, as well as transportation. Cynthia is going to be discussing today the importance of engaging with the comprehensive planning process and how participation can encourage positive policies for climate change and affordable housing going into 2024. This is our first official Lunch and Learn session in a series that will go to the end of the year, from now until December, hopefully having 2 Lunch and Learns a month until then, all dedicated to comprehensive plan updates and requirements for Pierce County. So stay tuned. We're going to have lots of other great presentations from Puyallup and City of Tacoma, hopefully Ruston. We've got Pierce County. You're getting HAPT numbers. We're getting all this stuff explained. So tell your friends. And just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions or feedback, kind of hold those until the end, if you don't mind. If it's super pressing, put it in the chat. And we will go through all of that. There's not a ton of us here today, so we'll have plenty of room for to get everybody's questions and discussion going. So, all right, with that, Cynthia, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Before I go into the presentation, let me just add a couple of things. You can tell from my background, I'm not a planner, but all of my jobs have involved either monitoring or developing plans for whatever agency I've been working with, or working on comprehensive planning for a given jurisdiction. So I have a lot of experience with it, although I don't do it directly. The second part I wanted to say is, why is the League of Women Voters involved in this? And I also do lobby, by the way, for the State League on growth management issues. The League is involved in this because we have a mission of defending democracy and empowering voters. And one of the things that we do to empower voters is provide good information on an objective, neutral basis. We advocate for positions that we develop after doing studies. And so all of these issues that Casey and I both mentioned we have positions that have been based on prior studies that we can advocate for. So that's how come the League of Women Voters has a voice on this issue. So I'm going to share my screen and can talk from there for a bit. And here we go. Maybe, here we go. So thank you to the Affordable Housing Consortium for inviting me to do this, because it's near and dear to my heart, and it's one of the priorities that our local league in Tacoma-Pierce County has adopted for this year. So what I'm going to talk about is what is comprehensive planning, why engagement is important, and what you can do to contribute to your community's plan. Those of you who are there probably know some of this already. Most people aren't really interested if they don't know a little bit. So I hope that I'm not going to be completely repetitive for you. But these are the topics. So what is the Growth Management Act? It's a statute that was passed in 1990, a long time ago. And the main goal of it back then was to create a boundary between the rural and the urban areas so that the urban areas did not sprawl any further. We were beginning to have massive sprawl at that time. And the concern was about retaining farmlands, forest lands, other critical areas, and that kind of thing. So the urban-rural boundary is an important aspect of that Growth Management Act. And then the League of Women Voters was involved way back then in getting that law passed, and we continue to manage. We continue to monitor what's going on and get our members involved in commenting when there are changes that we don't like or when there are changes we do like. So there are 13 goals. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but you can get the PowerPoint from the Affordable Housing Consortium. Basically, the goals are urban growth, keeping it inside the urban area, not letting it sprawl, as I mentioned. Making sure that there are multimodal forms of transportation, not just automobiles and trucks. Making sure that we have affordable housing for all economic segments of the population, which currently we do not. Making sure that we have good, strong economic development so that the economy works well for all parts of the population. And assuring, however, that property rights are not damaged in this process. And that there are permits that are processed so that things happen in a fair and objective manner, that we have strong industries related to natural resources, but that we do those things in a very protective way for the environment, that we have open space and recreation assured for our population, because it's so important, and particularly as density increases, and that we protect the environment. So all of those things are goals. They also include participation of citizens, which is one of the reasons that I'm making this presentation. And then assuring that public services and facilities that are necessary as growth continues and the population increases, making sure that we don't get ahead of the availability of services. And then finally, assuring that we preserve our historic values, lands and structures and arts and that kind of thing in this process. So out of all that, there are some mandatory elements in the plan that each jurisdiction is required to produce. And so the Growth Management Act is a set of values and concept and some regulations. And one of the regulations is that local jurisdictions have to provide a plan for their own jurisdiction and how it's going to accommodate these things for the next 20 years. So land use, housing, capital facilities plan means that it's the way that the jurisdiction assures that the services and utilities are available. So water systems, sewer systems, that kind of thing. And typically has a financial component too, showing how that they will be paid for. The utilities is specific to those things, how the rural area will be preserved and protected and what can go on there. Transportation system, economic development, park and recreation. So these are somewhat parallel to the goals, but not identical. And the schedule for updates is one that creates a very urgent need for Pierce County in particular this year. So this map shows for all the counties in the state when they have to do their next updates, and the Snohomish, King, and Pierce and Kitsap counties all have their updates due at the end of December 2024. The other counties have a little bit more time, as you can see on that map. So if you think about all those things that I just mentioned that have to go into a comprehensive plan, between this year and the end of next year is not a lot of time. So that creates some urgency for us. And not only that, the plan is supposed to last for 10 more years. So if we don't get our housing right, and we don't get our environmental mitigation and our climate change issues handled correctly in the plan, we aren't going to have a good future, because you know what's happening with climate change right now, and you know what's happening with homelessness. You know that there's not enough affordable housing, and so we have to get our plan right, because 2030 something is just going to be way too late to deal with those things. So the planning for housing now requires that the housing element accommodate housing affordable to every economic segment. So I'll explain what that implications of that are in a minute. As I mentioned, we've got to address homelessness, and then we have population growth. So as we go through this planning process, part of the message is that we cannot ignore these things. We have to assume that there's going to be increased density to accommodate both the needs of the current population and the future population. We cannot do a plan that assumes that we stay at the status quo. A lot of people are really concerned about what that means for them and their neighborhoods, but rest assured, nothing's going to happen overnight. The plan has to be done. So there has to be an inventory and analysis of the existing and projected housing needs. And it has to include the future needs for moderate, low, very low, and extremely low income housing. Also, emergency housing, emergency shelters, and permanent supportive housing. So those details have never been required before, which is another thing that's putting some urgency on this process. Because now we have to actually think about not only the number of people that we are expecting in the next 20 years, but what does the forecast look like in terms of the needs for especially those vulnerable populations, many of whom can't even afford housing now. This is a whole different twist on it that has never been done before. So in Pierce County, the population of cities between 25 and 75,000 have to allow at least 2 units per lot in all residential zoning. So that's brand new and something that some people are worried about. At least 4 units per lot within a quarter mile of major transit stop, and at least 4 units per lot if at least 1 unit is affordable housing. So that's quite a big change from current single family zoning that many counties have, and that is extensive in Pierce County. Cities with a population over 75,000, which is, I think, Tacoma only, they have to allow at least 4 units per lot in all residential zoning, at least 6 units per lot within a quarter mile walking distance of a major transit stop, and at least 6 units per lot if at least 2 are affordable housing. Again, quite a change from single family zoning. Now, that does not mean near every bus stop. So to clarify, a major transit stop is defined as on a high capacity system that is funded through the state and federal governments, which is commuter rail stops, fixed or stop on rail or fixed guideway systems, and then stops on bus rapid transit routes. Now, right now, there is only one bus rapid transit route that is contemplated in Pierce County, and it hasn't been developed yet. And that's the one that goes down to Spanaway from downtown Tacoma. So this does not mean that everybody has to expect high density right near every bus stop. And I want to be really assured about that. So the cities in Pierce County that are going to be the most affected. Starting at the bottom, Tacoma is clearly heavily impacted by this. These ranges I just developed because we don't have tables yet that show what each jurisdiction has to plan for. But one of the numbers is based on the relative share of the population of the cities in the entire Pierce County population. And then the other one is the share of the population among the urban population only. And right now, there's about 50% in the urban area and 50% in the rural areas, which is the largest geographic area. So Tacoma will have to either almost double or at least add a quarter more housing than it currently has. And then the numbers go down. Lakewood has a little bit, quite a bit less. Puyallup has less, and University Place has even less than that. So the Department of Commerce has developed numbers for what this is likely to mean. And so this is a very complicated table, and I'm hoping that you can read it in detail in the copy of the PowerPoint. But basically what it says is the total future housing needed here is in Pierce County is another 500,000 housing units. And that is over a 20-year span. It's not like tomorrow. Now, of those, permanent supportive housing has to be increased by 21,000. And then these, the range is 30, 50, and 80 to 100%. Those are considered poverty areas. 80 to 100 is more like the beginning of a median income, but 30 to 50 and 50 to 80 are definitely areas of poverty. These are the numbers that are anticipated as being needed. So if we look at the current housing supply, this is what we have now. And then the new housing that's needed is a lot less intimidating. So permanent supportive housing, we're going to need 20,000 in the next 10 years. This is quite a considerable increase over what we have now, 81%. The other numbers are a lot lower. So in the low median income categories, we have a need for an increase of 62% in the 30 to 50% area median income and 18% in the 50 to 80. These are the categories that are currently often homeless. And permanent supportive housing is defined as housing that has wraparound support services so that people who live there are typically people who cannot live independently without those services. So it's not only the construction cost of the facility that makes it very expensive, but also the need to provide those services. And so that is why it's that cost that's actually creating the great need there. Then when we go all the way down to the end, we need a lot more emergency housing and shelter beds than we currently have. One of the big concerns right now is that we have an increasing population of homeless people, and the shelters are not keeping up with that. So there's a big gap there. Now, I'm not going to, this is just the way that I calculated. So this is the way that I got that. So percentage of the county total and percentage of incorporated areas. So this is just an expansion going to Lakewood, Puyallup, Tacoma, and University Place, and showing what they need to do to increase permanent supportive housing in their jurisdiction, and then the low income and severely low income housing needs. So again, Tacoma has this very large number, and the others are a little bit more manageable, I think. And I think this is just a continuation, and then the shelter bed, I highlighted it in bright fluorescent because it's really, really important for people that don't have any housing at all. So the other thing that happened this year was some new requirements were put into the Growth Management Act related to climate change. And so local comprehensive plans also have to include strategies for climate mitigation and climate resilience. And my argument to you is that even though these requirements are not mandated for another year past the other update, if we don't plan for them at the same time, we're going to have a lot of awkward development. And I'll say more about that. So I'll say more about that in a minute, but these changes are likely to be controversial and challenging. And so what I want to do is make a pitch that if you get engaged now and your community gets engaged, you can make this a lot less intimidating and a lot more successful for your community. So one of the questions is, how should housing and climate change resilience work together? Well, the reality is that if we're going to increase the housing density in all of our cities, then what are we going to do about transportation? One of the things that we know from data is that operating an automobile for most families is averaging at about $10,000 a year. That sounds a little bit high, but it calculated based on the cost of purchasing the car, the cost of maintaining the car, the cost of insurance, and the cost of fuel. So if we're going to have all that density, where are we going to put all those cars? Well, we probably have to limit the parking requirements to increase the space. And so what are people going to do? My argument is that people have to be able to walk to where they have to go or use a bus. And that is the only way that this is going to work well. So waiting a year to put in the climate mitigation part is not going to work well if we're developing a housing plan. We've got to do those two things together so that the community has walkability and transit along with the housing density. We also have to make sure that in the zoning requirements that we allow for tree canopies, which are climate mitigation strategy, and shopping needs and schools and parks, the things that people need that they can walk to. So right now, when you think about most neighborhoods in Pierce County, you have to get in your car and drive to the grocery store. Many people drive their kids to school, and you have to drive to parks. So if we had communities that were organized around increased housing and more affordable housing for those people who can't afford what we currently have on the market, we could organize them around these other things that are climate supportive and create some unity and cohesion in the planning process. So I think that's enough. So how could this be more acceptable to you or your neighbors? Would it be how many units are in one spot? Would it be how the things are designed? Would it be street improvements that are needed, landscaping? What I'd like people to think about in advance of these plans coming out is, how could this be something that they could live with comfortably? So here are some examples of how some communities have approached increased density. So one of the options is duplexes and triplexes, which are on the top row. Another option is cottages. So when you think about 4 units on a lot, if it's a somewhat larger lot, it can accommodate this kind of a development. If it's a smaller lot, it might take this kind of development. Lost my arrows here. So another thing that some of the larger cities are doing is row houses, and some of them can be very, very attractive, but the lack of space in between the units allows more units to be developed, and they can be done well if planned ahead. And then courtyard apartments are another option. Again, like the other cottages, that these are not single units. They're more like a row house, but it's a single story, and they're more compact. And then we have in the larger jurisdictions, we can have live work buildings. So these are multi-use buildings where there is something commercial or office on the first floor and then the apartments up above. So that mixed use creates the opportunity to merge the things that we need with our housing so that people can walk to it more successfully. And then this is an example, it's a blurry picture, but it's an example of multifamily housing near the transit centers. And we're seeing a lot more of that now, particularly in King County. It's pretty amazing what's going on up there in terms of redevelopment. But these can be done well. And I was in Kirkland the other day where they have a lot of this near their transit center, and it's very attractive. But unless people have a sense of what it could be, it's very intimidating. That's why we need to get people involved. So here are accessory dwelling units, and there is a provision for nobody's allowed to refuse those in their zoning anymore. So here are some examples of how this can be done successfully and create a more unified look in any neighborhood. So walkability is one thing that is really important, again, for climate change. And it's also important for health and well-being. When people walk, they do better physically and mentally. So a walkable neighborhood is one that has a center. It has to have something that draws people there. And it could be a grocery store, it could be a school, it could be a little commercial area that has housing up above, but something that's a little bit cohesive that brings people in. And then there need to be enough people around that area to support those enterprises, whatever they may be. It could be a dry cleaner, it could be any small shop or whatever. But the population around it has to be sufficient to support the client base that's necessary for the business. Having a mixed income, mixed use allows affordable housing to be located near businesses and near other services. And developments like this can often be done where there's a combination of affordable and more expensive housing. What differs is what's on the inside. And so, again, planning ahead, the mixed use development can be very, very successful. We also need to have plenty of public places for people. We need green space for people to feel like they're not in a maze or in a rat's nest. And we need public space for that, and we need parks for that greenery. And then while we have all that density, we've got to have we've got to have the buildings separated from the street enough to have this space, but we also have to create a scenario where parking lots are not dominating the landscape. So either relegated to the back or to the basement or something else for the parking lot so that they're not dominating the space, and the walkability is the feature of the community. And I think I've said enough. Bicyclists, pedestrians, and transit need to all be able to access for the community. So here's a couple of pictures of how neighborhood grocery stores can be integrated. And then little pocket parks, which are common to a lot of neighborhoods in urban areas. So my pitch to you is to get involved now, to kind of organize your wish list about what would you like to see in your community when the density increases, because we don't get to say no density. What we want to do is say, how do we want it to happen? And then to contact your jurisdiction's planning department, get on the contact list, find out when they're doing what, and when you have an opportunity to comment. And in a minute, I'm going to show you that there are some needs to get outside of the regular planning process, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then talk to your friends and neighbors about this issue, because it's going to be more successful to get engaged if there are a group of people who all are thinking along the same lines and want to have the same thing happen. One of the things that is challenging in this planning process is if a lot of different people have a lot of different comments and it's fragmented. So nobody rises to the top in terms of level of importance for the planners or the elected officials. So the typical planning process is it starts with scoping, and most of the jurisdictions have done that already for their comprehensive plans. The scoping means what are we going to be looking at in this plan? Then it goes to drafting, then it goes to the public comment process, and then public comment is then extended in both the Planning Commission and the council. So there are formal processes at each step of the way after often in scoping as well. But the problem is if you wait till the Planning Commission or the council, you're not going to be as effective as if you get your comments in a little bit earlier. And that's because once the draft is finished, there's not an inclination to make a whole lot of change. So getting the comments in right up here is really critical. So one of the challenges is how to even know what to do. And one of the difficulties is trying to interpret schedules like this. So this is the Pierce County Comprehensive Review schedule for the 2024 adoption. So you see they did scoping up here. It was very, very limited, and almost nobody knew about it and almost nobody engaged with it. Then over here, all the way here at the end of this year, we have drafts, and then those go through the Planning Commission and the council with the adoption process at the end of next year. So my argument is that we get in with the planners this fall and talk to them about what each community hopes to see in these plans. The county is a little bit less impacted by the housing requirements than the cities are, but they still do have areas where they have to do that, and they certainly have to do climate mitigation. So another piece that I want to mention is that some jurisdictions already have what they call their housing action plan, but those housing action plans may not have already incorporated the new requirements. So one of the questions is, how are you going to adapt to the new 2023 requirements? So here's another example, and this is Puyallup. So Puyallup had a kickoff, and this is really hard to read, but it has a kickoff at mid 2023. And I'm not sure where they are in that process. I couldn't quite find it. But then they have what they call community priorities workshop here. Now, somewhere between the fourth quarter of 2023 and the second quarter of 2024 is when people in Puyallup really need to make their point to the planners, so that when this draft comes out and there's an open house, it's not too late. Then here's another example, Gig Harbor. This one's a little easier to read. So they started their public outreach in April this year, and they're gathering data, and they're doing their analysis, and they're going to have public hearings. They have public hearings, excuse me, in June. Now, they did a pretty good job of advertising this, and Gig Harbor is a small community, and they got quite a bit of participation. But if people didn't tune in and they really want to, they can still get to the staff before September of this year, because that is an accelerated plan process. And then in Fife, another one is have your say. They're doing it differently. They have an online survey that they're asking for comments through. So if residents of Fife want to comment now, they can. And Fife has already done its scoping and is well on its way to analysis, but it's not too late to make your comments heard. So those are examples of how different jurisdictions are handling this. And so what I've done, if you want to give the PowerPoint, is I made several resource lists here. So the Department of Commerce manages this. So they're the ones that approve the final plan once every council has adopted it. And they also have a tremendous amount of resource information on their website. They have guidelines as well that the jurisdictions have to follow. Then there's what's called the Municipal Research Services Center. they have different kinds of information. Some of it overlaps with commerce and some of it is just a link to commerce. But the MRSC has examples of various communities' plans that people can actually look at and access easily. The Puget Sound Regional Council and the Pierce County Regional Council are two bodies that have done advanced planning, and according to the law, the comp plans have to be consistent with those. So the Puget Sound Regional Council is King, Snohomish, Pierce, and Kitsap. Those are the ones that have their plans due this 2024. They have adopted a Vision 2050 comprehensive plan that's quite large in scope, and it's everything that the jurisdictions do has to be consistent with it. Then there's a Pierce County countywide planning policies, and that council is a group of elected officials who represent the cities, and they get together and they have developed already the countywide planning policies, and the local jurisdictions have to be compatible with those too. So there's a lot of background that says, here's what you have to accomplish in your plan. Here are some policies that you have to be compliant with. And that is, sometimes it's too technical to read, but if you wanted to go in and get more detail, those are some places. Then I've added Tacoma University Place, the Puyallup and Lakewood in sequence here, and where you can get information about their comp planning processes. And in Lakewood, it was buried a little bit. So I have a couple of sites there. And Puyallup, Gig Harbor, Fife. Bonnie Lake is another one that is probably coming from behind. And Bonnie Lake is an interesting community. And so if you know anybody or if any of you live there, getting involved in their planning process might be really important. And then Pierce County Comprehensive Plan. So that's my presentation. I'm more than happy to, if I can stop share here, more than happy to answer any questions. I hope that was somewhat informative. And I'm sorry the audience today is so small, because I really was hoping to try and motivate people to get engaged. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. It's Amanda. I feel the same. When we talk about comprehensive planning, I often it can be so much, I think, and it's really daunting. So these presentations are really helpful for people to understand the breakdown of how planning works and where they can actually make a difference. But even me as an affordable housing, policy person, I struggle even with knowing how to get involved. So my question is actually, I know, so for us as the Affordable Housing Consortium, we're trying to put on these events sharing information, but we aren't at the point yet where we're able to really engage people to say, here's an action you can take. Is the league doing something along those lines that people maybe hear, or that we can share with our broader network how they can be involved in the process?
Well, as I was trying to say here, and number one, I agree with you. The process is confusing. The plans are extensive and so forth. But what the key message is how do you want your future to look? The league is planning, and we're going to do a kickoff on September 16th to have a workshop where people can come and use maps and pictures to actually say, here's what I would like to see in my community in the next plan. And then we're hoping to provide them with ways they can get that information to the planners. So what I talked about was the public processes that are structured and scheduled right now are far apart. Some of them have already happened. So it's late in that regard, but we can still get to the planners, and we're providing a workshop to learn how to do that on September 16th. It's a 3-hour workshop, and I'll give you the information once we have all the details. what we want to do is do that same workshop in a number of different places, but haven't really been invited to do that. So we're not sure yet how to do that. So if anybody is interested, let us know, and we will take that workshop to any neighborhood or any community.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Jason?
Yeah, so let's say a city comes up with their plan, it meets all these requirements. Are they held accountable for following that plan? Like, for example, they're going to say they're going to add so many affordable housing units, but then they never approve the zoning for the affordable housing units.
Well, the zoning is in the plan. So that is one of the things that we have to watch before they adopt it. So that's number one. Number two, Commerce is intended to kind of monitor implementation, although they can't possibly do it all. There are groups such as the one that comes to my mind is FutureWise, but there are others who have actually sued jurisdictions for not following the comp plans, and that's an option, although it's pretty drastic. When I worked in Thurston County, there had already been a lawsuit filed and they won. The county was ignoring its comp plan. In fact, the county had decided they weren't even going to have a rural urban boundary that meant anything. So they had to stop and regroup, and I mean, the court forced that. So there are implementation methods, and accountability methods, but they're pretty drastic. So that's another reason why getting engaged now and making sure that the zoning is what we want, and then tracking it later. It's easier to hold a jurisdiction accountable when they've done the right thing in the first place than it is if they don't do it correctly in the beginning. I didn't fully answer your question, but accountability is a challenge.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Any other questions?
I actually did have a question. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't really know if this is relevant to this conversation. I mean, it is relevant, but I don't know if you can answer it. I just keep asking myself, you know, we have a lot of, I mean, even where I live in Hilltop, we basically live in a food desert. You know, there are a lot of food access issues in Tacoma, and I really wonder if alongside this, you know, increased density, all this rezoning for, you know, development of affordable and other housing, is there also a plan congruent enough to allow enough access to food? There's one, you know, there next to me, there's one grocery store, and you probably have to drive about 10 or so minutes to a different one. So it kind of makes it, I just have a lot of questions around it. Do you have anything?
I think that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. And that is that the climate resilience part will be things like reducing automobile use. I don't know if you all realize, but automobiles contribute 47% in that order of magnitude of the greenhouse gas emissions in Pierce County. So how are we going to manage our climate change if we don't cut down our automobile use? So that's if it's things like that, and planting trees and creating walkability, if we don't do that along with the housing, then it will work. So I'm advocating for communities looking at their increased density and saying we have got to have grocery stores within a walkable distance. They can be small, but Europe does this all over the place. I stayed in Rome for 3 months a few years ago, and we could walk 2 doors down and have a store that was like a 7-Eleven size, but it didn't have junk food and it didn't have pop. So you could buy anything you needed in there. And we can do that if we say this is what we have to have. So your point is what I'm trying to say, which is we have to advocate for the planners to think this through. And if we don't advocate for it, they won't do it.
Absolutely.
And it's particularly important for low-income people. They can't all afford cars. And if parking becomes an issue, they can't afford renting a parking space. They've got to have the ability to walk to what they need or take the bus. And who wants to take the bus to a grocery store for, a week's worth of food when they could have a smaller grocery store within walking distance and shop when they need? So I'm sorry, I'm getting kind of emotional here, but we have to think this through for the future or it won't work.
And just to piggyback on the accountability aspect of it, that's why we're doing this as well. Once we started to track each jurisdiction and where they were in the process and things for the update, we did start to notice that a couple of cities are proposing or planning some kind of harmful legislation that will make it harder to build affordable housing. So they're kind of taking commerce and they're taking the recommendations and the requirements. They're kind of either misunderstanding them or misinterpreting them. So we're trying to also mitigate those things in the, once we see something that's troubling, trying to get involved. But even before you see something that's troubling is just having things to say in the right spaces is
It's critical.
Mhm.
So offline, let's talk about getting the league more involved in those cases that you just mentioned. Well, I hope this was somewhat useful. I don't know, it was somewhat aspirational, but I think that the nature of the problems that we're facing require us to think differently, and that's the message I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Do you have anything else to say, Amanda?
No, I just, Cynthia will continue working with you to help get out information about the importance of the comprehensive plans. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just so everybody knows, we are having some more, like I mentioned. So stay tuned. They're all going to be building on each other. So we've got this one, we've got Laura Hodgson from Department of Commerce coming in a couple of weeks. We're going to hopefully have one of the lawyers from Tacoma pro bono community lawyers come in and talk to us about the new rental housing code in Tacoma. That's very recent, and lots of people are kind of curious and confused by that. So we're going to also have FutureWise, Alex from FutureWise come and give a talk about HB 1220. We've got HAPT numbers coming from Pierce County. We've got all these things that's going to keep building on each other. So stay tuned and join us for those for sure. And we'll keep posting the slides and the recordings and stuff. So again, just check the event page where you RSVP'd, and that's hopefully where we're going to post those things and send you an email as well. So hope to see you guys soon. Enjoy your Thursday. Is that what it is? Great.
Have a good weekend, everybody, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.